Hello, and welcome to Be the Media Huntington. We have a special for you today, and it's on the Huntington Historical Society Soldiers and Sailors Museum. My name is Jenny Lee, and I have with me Miss Dana.
Hi, guys.
And Miss Lisa.
Hi, everyone.
So during the months of May and June of 2018, the ladies from the Huntington View were allowed a very special privilege of a private tour of the Huntington Historical Society Soldier and Sailors Museum and Cemetery Tour. We are bringing this to you today, and we are going to piece it together as we did when we were there with the wonderful Toby Kissam. How did you guys enjoy, or how did you find what we first did in May?
Very informative. It was very cool. I love learning all about old history, especially the town you live in.
And so the first thing we did is we walked into the museum. This is on Main Street in Huntington, New York.
Welcome to the Huntington Historical Society.
Hi.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having us.
And we met our hosts for the day, and that was Toby Kissam, and he was extremely informative in what he had to offer to us. Did you guys find the same?
I did. I love history. I'm a big history buff, and I found out so much information I didn't even know existed in this town. So it gave me the opportunity to go search a little further and find out some more research. But he had so many things down pat that I knew exactly where to go. I didn't have to start fresh. And it was very, the items that they had in there were actually old artifacts. So it was really cool.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
And so one of the first pieces that he gave us on our tour was about the Gilded Age.
Hi, I'm Toby Kissam, and I'm involved with the Huntington Historical Society, and I curate this exhibit, which is entitled Huntington's Gilded Age and Age of Guilds. Now, the Gilded Age, of course, is obvious to everybody. It's when the Gold Coast mansions were built here in Huntington, and it covers the time frame from 1890 to 1940. The Age of Guilds talks about the civic associations that were formed during that time frame. And the premise of the whole exhibit really is that it's this 50-year period that has defined the great town that we live in today. And it's a town that we hope we see preserved as the ages go on. And the purpose of this was inspired really by two things. One, in 1960, after World War II, when Long Island began to be suburbanized, there was an article written in the Yale Journal that talked about talked about the forming of the suburbs and how some towns acclimated to the growth of suburbia better than others. And they talked about a specific town, though they didn't name it. The town they were referring to was Huntington, and how successfully we formed from a country town that was in existence before into the great town that we have today in suburbia. And it involves the buildings that were built and the people that lived here and the merchants that created the civic associations that we still have today. And these are the timeline that we had from 1890 to 1940. And it illustrates some of the buildings that are later talked about in another part of the exhibit that were built during that time. Some of the wealthy people that created their mansions in Huntington, like Marshall Field III, Albert Milbank, Henry Cannon. Obviously, there was Oheka was built by Otto Kahn, and there were others. There was William K. Vanderbilt and so forth and so on. But it also refers to this great building that we're in right now, which is built in 1892 as the first public library. And it was formed by the locals that lived in Huntington that felt they wanted to enhance their town by building a public library building. So one of the things that capped off this period was the 250th anniversary celebration of the town of Huntington. It was founded in 1653. So in 1903.
And I know that we cut there a little bit. You can kind of see that we had a short little cut in there. So I'll bring you when I will bring this other part to you. I apologize. But he was so informative with everything, which is great because we don't know this, but we can bring you all his knowledge.
Things that happened in the 1890 to 1940 period was the 250th celebration of the founding of Huntington. Huntington was founded in 1653. And so in 1903, the sitting president, President Roosevelt, came over from Sagamore Hill and gave the July 4th speech. And it was a grand celebration where, and that story is told on the backside of this, and we'll come around and see that later. But so this kind of gives you the overview. I would welcome you to come in and see this exhibit and start here and read about it, and then you'll go around and you'll see some of the individual stories that are told in greater detail.
And I think that that was one of our favorite stories that he ended up telling next, which is why we all wore white today. It was the story of the ladies in white.
Yes.
And they recently, the town of Huntington did put up a one of the blue signs, the historical signs of where the women's suffrage movement had begun. You know, people don't realize Sagamore Hill with Teddy Roosevelt over in Oyster Bay, that he used to give speeches on the lawn there and it would fill up. And that's where he goes in, I believe, the next segment. Which is this one. Pardon me. Sometimes it takes a little while to get our screens to go back.
Yeah, but it's good.
So here we have a picture.
Oh, goodness.
So here we have eggs.
Yes, we have eggs.
Probably
well, no,
Jenny's
it all
backyard.
starts with the eggs. We never know what comes first, the chicken or the egg. So I will go ahead.
It's going on this morning.
Back up for you. We always have a little technical issues. Again, we're a citizen-driven. We don't work out of a studio, so we'll just do our best that we can when we come here, and we expect that we're going to have a few faux pas.
This is real and raw, people. Real
So here we have a picture of Teddy talking to the townsfolk just north of this location, really. He came over by his private yacht. They picked him up down on the bay and carriaged him into up New York Avenue until they got to the speaker's platform. And here he gave the July 4th address. There was a parade that these pictures are before, and there was just a grand celebration. And down below, you see all of the different committees and their private ribbons that they had. There was a committee for different entertainment, and there was a parade committee, and so all the kind of committees you'd have for a town-wide celebration.
Toby, can you please tell me why these beautiful ladies are dressed in white?
Well, they formed, they were actually in charge, and they created the whole celebration. They were called, they were the grand dames of Huntington at the time. They were actually, after the celebration and after the parade, they're the ones that formed the Colonial Society of Huntington that in 1903, that later became the Huntington Historical Society. So we call these the mothers of the society, and there were 5 in particular that are dedicated in our archives that way. But this actually was made into a postcard in 1903 by the Gildersleeve store. That was a stationery store basically in Huntington, and then it sold postcards. So one of the interesting things that happened in the parade, that that cannon that sits out in front of this building was donated to the town at that point for the celebration. And so it was in the parade. It was in a nice, you can see it here in its float, but the float broke down. Luckily, it broke down right out in front here, and so they just had to get the cannon up the hill, and it's been there ever since 1903. Of course, this great building was the public library from 1892 to 1958. And in 1958, as you can see, the size of it isn't very big. They had expanded by making a second story for the stacks up there with a circular staircase that went up to it, but it was still got too small. So in 1958, they bought the old telephone building, which is now which now is the Huntington Public Library, but it's been expanded on it. But at the corner of Prospect and Main Street on the south side, across from the St. John's Church, and they closed the library. They encouraged the town folks to take books out, and keep them for a long time. And when they were ready to take them, they asked them to return them to the new library, and that's how they moved the collection for the most part from this facility down to the other facility. So the telephone building, which was one of the buildings built in 1916, continues today to service as the public library. This building now is owned by the Huntington Historical Society, built in 1892, still continues to serve the community. And this is the kind of reuse of historic buildings that we're so proud of here in Huntington, and we hope continues.
That was interesting.
Yeah, I love that story of the grand dames, the mothers of the society.
Women start everything.
We are the leaders, that is no doubt.
And it was interesting how small, if we look at today's library size and regular libraries, it's so amazing to think of how many people could actually go in. It's so small for a library.
Our needs were much less back then.
I mean, it had to be less to none, or maybe people couldn't really get, I don't know, but it was just incredibly small. It was hard to fathom having a lot of books in there and people.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely with the people.
Yeah, I think it would be either one or the other, either a lot of books or a lot of people, but not both. So it's very interesting. And I'm glad they were able to reuse it so we didn't lose it.
Absolutely.
You know, we need to do that a lot more.
Recycling.
Than what we're doing, just developing everything.
And so here's
over here we have really the Gilded Age, where we present all of the Gold Coast mansions that were built during this time frame and period. And one of the things that inspired this exhibit was the fact that we got access to a collection of family photographs of this gentleman over here, Albert Milbank, and his family, who built an estate house. Now, it's not really considered one of the larger Gold Coast mansions, but it's one of the ones that still stands today. It's owned privately. Mr. Milbank was a big-time lawyer in New York City. He was also married into the Anderson family, and his great aunt was Elizabeth Anderson, who had come out and bought a lot of property out here, a lot of the farmland. And so in 1915, he builds Panfield, which is the estate now out in Lloyd Harbor that still stands. And in this series of photographs, the family photographs, is this wonderful exhibit. That's the estate, Panfield. And then next to it is, of course, a picture of wonderful two women in wonderful dresses, white party dresses, garden dresses, if you'd like, at a function out at Panfield at one point. The property before it was developed in an estate was owned by Admiral Paulding, who is famous for during the War of 1812, he was a Navy sailor, and then during the Civil War, a Navy officer, and then during the Civil War, he was the commandant of Brooklyn Navy Yard, and he bought a farmhouse out here in 1835. And that eventually is the land that Panfield was built on. Of course, there are other better known and locally known here. August Heckscher builds his big estate here in this picture. It's a wood house out in what is called Upper Wincoma now. The estate house is no longer there. It was sold, it burned down in 1941, and the property was sold and it was developed into Upper and Lower Wincoma. And that may be familiar to many of the people that live in Huntington. This is a picture of the Huntington Harbor, and it's on this neck where Panfield is, and it's over here where August Hector. They were kind of across the inlet from one another. Of course, there was also the Otto Kahn estate, which still serves the community today, that's built out in Cold Spring Hills. He was a banker, made a lot of money, came out here in 1919, and built which was the second largest home private home ever built in America. The largest home was the Biltmore home built by George Washington Vanderbilt down in Asheville, North Carolina. This is the second largest home built. Then we have the Comset estate that was built by Marshall Field III. And of course, that still serves the community as a New York State park. The mansion, unfortunately, isn't open often to the public, but it still stands, most of it anyway. One of the wings had been taken down. But that's still one of the Gold Coast mansions that survives today. And next to that is Ferguson's Castle that stood on the east shore of Huntington Harbor. That was built in 1911. It has been taken down and is no longer there, except for the gatehouse that still sits on East Shore Road. And then it was West Neck Farms that was built in 1912 by George McKesson Brown. Now, that's probably more familiar to people, known as Quandra Hall. It was bought by Suffolk County in 1973. It was a park and a venue for social affairs in the castle. And it's a nice way, again, to preserve the castle. This series of buildings here, which were the caretaker's cottage and the water tower and the stables, still serves the community today as the Unitarian Universalist Church out on Browns Road.
I didn't know that.
And then, of course, in Centerport, there was William K. Vanderbilt's Eagle's Nest that was started in 1911.
I think one of the other historians, the town historian, had walked in at that point and did not realize that we were filming.
Yeah.
But wow, he goes over Oheka Castle and Condrey Hall and many others.
I have a question, though.
Oops, sorry. It was Toby laughing at us.
I have a question about Comset Park. Was that Lloyd Harbor who owned it, or whose house is on there now?
That's a good question. I mean, that's something that they would have to answer for us. They would know best. It may even be answered in the next segment.
He mentioned it now. That's why I thought maybe somebody else caught it. I didn't. I didn't realize he said that. I thought I was under a different impression, but maybe it is. Let's see what happens in the next.
Lloyd Neck was all completely, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to find out, though.
Very interesting.
Okay, in this description here, it tells us that the saltwater pool remained. Where is the pool at here?
Well, the pool, the remnants of it remain, because, I mean, basically, this would have been the saltwater pool that was on the August Hector estate. He had developed, there was statuary around it and everything else. It was quite a fancy party place for him, but it filled up by the tide with salt water and became a swimming hole, basically. It no longer is there as a pool. It's been filled in to serve as the parking lot for the beach community that the beach club is from the Wincoma community.
Paradise. And so the Gilded Age, you said, was the beginning of...
The Gilded Age is the mansions. The Age of Guilds, we're going to talk about. Actually, we can come over here and maybe start... The Age of Guilds. Guilds basically are merchant groups or civic groups, community groups that were talked about in Europe, but that also certainly applied in the United States. And there were groups like the Chamber of Commerce, which was formed in 1925. One of the founders of the Chamber of Commerce was August Heckscher. August Heckscher, again, being one of the wealthy people who had an estate out here, but he embraced the town and so helped them form their civic groups. And in 1925, they formed the Chamber of Commerce. One of the big projects that the Chamber of Commerce initiated, really, was a modern brick fireproof hotel that was successfully built finally in 1929 at the corner of New York Avenue and Fairview. It was known for years later on as the ABOPS building. It was a building that didn't look like much as it near a couple of years ago, and they decided to tear it down and put up the TD Bank, a new building for the TD Bank. But that's where the 1929 hotel was first built, and it was initiated and encouraged by the Chamber of Commerce. There are a number of other people in the Chamber of Commerce. This is a picture of August in the community with his current supervisor at the time, A.L. Field, and Robert Toaz, who was the principal of one of the schools. And for a long time, the school was named after him. And this is the original offices of the Chamber of Commerce, which were on New York Avenue, just a little south of where the Paramount Theater is today. And of course, you'll recognize a lot of the names. There are Conklins and Gallows and Gormleys. Gormley is a street out in Wincoma named after him because he was a real estate developer who developed Lower Wincoma. There are also Samuses, obviously, and Cook, who was the local pharmacist in town. Michael Connell, you may know the M.A. Connell Funeral Home that's still in business today. And so there were a tremendous number of local people and some of the wealthy summer people formed the Chamber of Commerce. As was the case in a number of the other civic associations. The DAR, of course, it was formed and their home still stands today. It was the original Universalist Church that stood on Nassau Road and now serves as the DAR chapter home. As I mentioned earlier, the Huntington Historical Society was formed in 1903 by the same ladies who had that great celebration, the 250th anniversary celebration. And in 1911, the Conklin House at the head of, well, I call it the head of New York Avenue, but it says New York Avenue takes the bend as it's going south at the corner of High Street, still serves the community today as Suffolk County's first house museum. And there are a couple of pictures of it here and some gavels from early ages. And there's a great article in here from the paper about how the DAR helped the SAR get started. So the Daughters of the American Revolution helped the Sons of the American Revolution get going 2 years after they were formed.
So the ladies led the way.
The ladies led the way, as is pretty much true in
You're
this.
saying the ladies pretty much started the first civic
groups. They were very much involved with forming the civic groups. I mean, one of the interesting things about this building, this building was built as a memorial to the veterans of the Civil War, and some of their names are listed here in this tablet. And it was basically a men's association.
What is that?
So interesting. It really, really just is.
I loved it.
And
He had all the information.
He really is a wealth of just absolute knowledge. And I believe that we reached the point now where you took him over to that very interesting clock, and he started talking about the glass being the original. But this one's a really good segment. Again, he is just a wealth of knowledge. I don't know how he does it.
Okay, one of the things that we were talking about with the civic associations that were formed during the time and during this period of time. And of course, this building was built in 1892 as a public library, but it was also built as a memorial to the soldiers and sailors that died or fought in the American Civil War. And some of those that had died are listed here in this memorial plaque here. Interesting enough that second name down in the middle column, J.C. Walters, a woman walked in a number of years ago and said, pointed to that name and said, "I have his portrait, would you like it?" And his portrait is hanging over here now, and she donated that portrait. It came up from Florida. And as far as we can tell, he was the first Huntington soldier to actually die in the Civil War. He died in 1861 in one of the early battles down in Virginia. But as the men had formed the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Association, their wives seemed to be forming the Public Library Association, which was in 1875. So there must have been some talk over the dining room table at some point when the men were looking to build this memorial. The women must have convinced them to build a building that would have some use and could house their library. And so that's exactly what happened in 1892. This building was opened as the public library as well as a memorial, and it's called the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Building.
Now, were the people at that time, the people in Huntington, were they against or were they for the Civil War?
Oh, definitely before that. If you read the editorials in the Long Islander, well, actually, there was, as in every family, there was disputes.
Yeah.
But the Long Islander, if you read which was published back then, of course, it's been published since 1838. You read the editorials in the Long Islander, they were passionately in favor of abolitionists, and they were definitely felt the Civil War should be fought, and the country should maintain together, and the slavery should be undone. And there were passionate editorials in the Long Islander that are always fun to read. And when we did Civil War exhibits here, we actually printed out some of those. And then, go ahead.
On here, I see any relation to?
Oh, sure. The Conklin family is all related. They actually come from a John Conklin who settled here in the 1650s and 60s. And there's, if you believe you're a descendant of a Conklin family, then you want to find your ancestors, you definitely want to come to our archives, because we have not a complete, but a pretty complete Conklin family genealogy, as well as information on the Samus family, the Prime family, all the other names that you see up here, the Wood family, the Valentine family. You'll see a lot of street names up here too. Brushes, obviously, is a local family, the Stillwell family, the Belzer family. All these names, Bunce, are all part of it. Yep, yep. So there's a lot of history in there. Well, other than the fact that one of these photographs, I believe, over here of the library, it's a clock is in our collection, but this one of the early photographs shows a very similar clock. They're called basically box clocks, and they were popular during the time this building was built, on the mantle. And now this is before that, as you can see, there's no tablet there. So this was done very early in the life of the building. Now the windows are the same, and we ought to talk about those a little bit. But this statue is in the public library foyer as you walk in down in its new location, so that stays. And of course, there's one of the original tables, library tables, is over there, and the second table is both. We have two tables from the original library. Right, right.
So what about these the windows?
Well, the windows are, very special. They were done, obviously, at the time, 1892. They were designed by the architects. A lot of people would like to think they're Tiffany windows. We have no reason to believe that Tiffany actually made these, but they were the type of windows that Tiffany would have made. And when we look at them, and look at them closely, there are two things, the design of these windows, we see two things that relate them, one to the original use of this building, and secondly to the location of this building. Because as you're going to tour, I think later on in your show, the graveyard, you can see some tombstones there in the design of the window. And then in between the tombstones, you can see what we consider to be bookends, which of course this was the original library.
Are those original books as well?
These are some of the books that the historian whose office is down here has as research material. You know, there's some of the Huntington Town records are here, other reference books that would relate to the history of Long Island, actually. And there, of course, there are many, many, many of those books.
Now, in regards to this uniform, I know that it has already been stripped and it's now, but I'm curious, did they write anything else on how it kept the soldiers warm? Because I know during the Civil War, they had great periods during the cold.
Yeah.
I see that these are wrapped down here.
Right.
Was that to help?
Well, the uniform is wool, and that would have helped. This, I forget now what the story is. This is a World War I uniform. And during World War I, of course, there were a number of soldiers from Huntington that also went to that war and went over to Europe and fought in that war. And one of the recognizable people, he was in the class of 1911 at Huntington High School, was Leroy Grumman, who went on to found, of course, the great aviation company here on Long Island. And this is his picture. He was in the class of 1911. And there he is. There is the little blonde boy, and here he is standing outside his home on which is Central Street in Huntington, on his way in his Army uniform. Now this is not his uniform, but it is typical of what the uniform would be. Here is another picture during the snowstorm of that period, and that's at the intersection of West Neck Road, which is today West Neck Road, and Main Street. Outside the Wood House, and they were there watching probably the bobsled races in 1917, which is when that photograph was taken. Now, the bobsled races are a great story too, but we only have a little bit to show on them.
And what was the story behind it?
Well, okay, the bobsled races in Huntington were part of the Winter Carnival that was held between 1907 and 1920. In these long, sometimes 30-foot long bobsleds that held as many as 25 men on them, or women, because there were women's sleds as well, would start up at the top of the hill where Lawrence Road is emptying into Main Street, and then end almost to this building, or at this building is when most of the sleds came to a stop. And of course, they closed off Main Street. They iced down the roads. They had to wait for some snow, and then they knew it was going to stay cold. So they had a water truck go out and ice down some of the roads. And these big bobsleds would be hauled from all over the island to come and race in the Huntington Winter Carnival. There was a sled named the Huntington. There were sleds from Locust Valley, Manhasset. From the South Shore, they came up with some bobsleds, and as far away as Connecticut would come to race in the Huntington Carnival. This is the map of it, really. They would start up here at the Carly crosses Lawrence Hill Road. And then it was a pretty straight run. The only problem was right around the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is today here, but when it was a little bit further east, there's a bend in the road. And in 1920, and during one of the trial runs early in the morning, the women's sled, the Greyhound, came down on one of its trial runs. And just as they were reaching that curve, now you had some ability to turn, but you couldn't turn very sharply. You were going as fast as 40 to 50 miles an hour at that point. And so you could slightly turn, but a photographer who wanted to take their picture yelled up, "Look this way," and they all looked to the left, and that leaned the sled over, and they tumbled over, and a number of them were fairly severely hurt. Nobody was killed. There were some incidences reported where some of the sleds ran into carriages. I think maybe a dog was run over at one point during one of the races. But after 1920, they ended them after that accident. Now, whether it was the accident that ended the races or whether it was the fact that automobiles were now more prevalent in Huntington and the owners of those automobiles didn't want the roads iced up. Right. You don't today intentionally ice up roads.
Were there any prizes?
Oh, yes, that's a good point. Definitely there were prizes. There were big silver cups awarded, and there were two winners. One was for the fastest recorded time because there was a finish line right about where Starbucks is today. And whoever crossed that in the fastest, they had a timer that started up when they crossed over Carly Avenue and that clicked off when they crossed over Wall Street, right where Starbucks is today. And then they also had an award not only for the fastest time, but for the longest fetch. And the longest fetch was how far the sled went. And as I said, most of them coasted to a stop as they began going up this hill here by the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial. But one year, the course was so fast and the two sleds were so fast that they actually continued up over the top of this hill, went down to Spring Street and halfway up the hill to the Presbyterian Church. So they got going pretty fast, and there was a tremendous amount of weight carrying there.
25 minutes.
I thought that was so cool.
Yeah, he definitely. I have to say he gets the I Love Huntington the most award.
Yeah,
He really does. Okay, so then we went to the other wall, and I'm going to go ahead and apologize for bumping into the chair now. Didn't mean to do that at all. But we did, when you're filming, like I said, we're just citizen-driven people who want to learn more about our town and current events. So we do sometimes have those little idiosyncrasies.
So this wall, again, talks more about the Civic Association's form, the Age of Guilds. And here we find that the Boy Scouts, which were founded in Huntington in 1910, shortly after they were founded internationally. And there are a couple of pictures here of the Huntington troop marching up to Sagamore Hill and meeting Colonel Roosevelt, who, of course, now is a retired president, but living in Sagamore Hill. He dies, I think, in 1919. But you can see the Nathan Hale Boy Scout troop exercising in front of Theodore Roosevelt on his porch at Sagamore Hill. They had their headquarters in above the hardware store on Main Street, the south side of Main Street, were the headquarters that were formed there. And then a couple of years later, in 1917, the Girl Scouts were formed. They were actually followed a second group of girls that had formed to not compete, but to coexist, I guess, with the Boy Scouts, which were called the Campfire Girls. And they were founded in 1916. And over here, there's a Memorial Day parade down Main Street that shows the Campfire Girls marching. And here, of course, we have a uniform in our costume collection of the Campfire Girls.
That's what they were?
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was Indian.
Yeah, but they were called Campfire Girls.
That's great.
And they were all the same. They had a headband. I mean, they were dressed in Native American attire, what would appear to be. And this is a costume that was donated to the society years ago. And we don't often get a chance to display it.
No, it says the National Red Cross pageant.
Yes.
Is that an actual?
Okay. The Red Cross was founded here in Huntington and across the country, really, in response to World War I in 1917. And each chapter had to raise its own money and so forth. And one of the estates in Huntington, one of the gilded estates, the Gold Coast mansions in Huntington, was called Rosemary Farm, and it was the estate of Roland Conklin. Now, Conklin is descendant of the original Conklins of Huntington, but he didn't grow up on Long Island or in Huntington. He grew up in Chicago and in Iowa and made a lot of money, came back, and his business had offices in New York City. And so he decided, well, he would build himself a Gold Coast mansion, and he would go back to the home of his ancestors. He came back to Huntington, and he built this estate, which he called Rosemary Farm, on West Neck Road. Now, in 1917, I believe it was, he decided, one of the things in the estate was this great amphitheater he built, natural outdoor amphitheater. And in 1917, he hosted a program to raise money for the Red Cross. And famous stars of the day came out and acted in the show. They had a smoke screen, literally a smoke screen, instead of a cloth screen that you would see on a Broadway stage, but they were able to create a mist so that the actors could change on the stage. The stage is on the left of that, and the seating was up on the natural amphitheater. Now, this flag, of course, is very significant. It's Troop 1 in Huntington. It was found in lost track of what I'm trying to say here. This flag was found by Troop 12, I think, which is today, in their file cabinet, just folded up, and they put it out, and they decided, well, this was an historic flag, and here you see the troop donating the flag to the Historical Society in front of the Conklin House. Now, we believe that the flag that they're carrying over there in 1917 up to Sagamore Hill when they visited Colonel Roosevelt is that same flag.
It's interesting. I know this man. His name is Leary,
Mm-hmm.
and he performs.
Yep.
He's what a great man.
He performed in 1776 at the Engelman.
Yes, he performs frequently in
Mm-hmm.
He's an actor, of course.
Yeah. So I think we've covered that.
I was so excited to see my friend Leary, who is he's a local celebrity, that I bumped into the chair.
This wall.
So how about that, huh? The Red Cross was founded in Huntington?
Very cool.
And one of the first troops of the Boy Scouts?
Yeah, I love learning about the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts. I loved being a Girl Scout myself when I was little. I still have my original sash, and my daughter was, and I was the Girl Scout leader. And I tried my best to capture the kids' interest in talking about the history and the start in 1917 and the Campfire Girls year before that. It was really cool.
Yeah, that uniform was crazy.
Yeah, it looked like Pocahontas a little.
Did. All right, so I think he takes us on to the next wall here.
When we were trying to come up with a title for this exhibit, one of the titles that was thrown around were the Moguls and the Locals. That the Moguls were the ones that, of course, that built the Gold Coast mansions, and the Locals were the ones that were really the founders of the guilds, the civic associations. Though, as we found when we did the research, that many times the Moguls, the wealthy people, contributed not just their money, but their time and their influence. And so over here we have a mixture. We have August Henry Gallo here in his Navy uniform. He was a good friend of Leroy Grumman. He was in the class of 1912 at Huntington High School, also a baseball player with Leroy Grumman. But he went on to Cornell and became an architect. And then he came back home, and he was the designer of many of the buildings that were built particularly on New York Avenue during this period of time. He was the designer of that hotel that we talked about earlier, that's the Chamber of Commerce. He also was an early member of the Chamber of Commerce. Up above, you have the Wood family, and of course, the Wood family, you have Wood and Coal, you have the Wood Lumber Company, all of those things. They were also local people. They were early settlers of Huntington. They descend from early settlers of Huntington. W. Wilton Wood lived from 1852 to 1935, and he was a ninth generation Wood family, all in Huntington. Below, of course, you see a picture of Otto Kahn, who's Ohika fame. Next to him is Marshall Field, and then we kind of list all of their contributions that they made to the Huntington Society. And over on the right-hand side, we have August Heckscher. And of course, August Heckscher's name is very familiar to those who live in Huntington. We have Heckscher Park, we have Heckscher Museum, all because of the philanthropy of August Heckscher.
Now, as a historical society, I know you guys have to have an opinion on how much they're destroying so much of the history. What say do they even consult you when they decide to make these changes to build everywhere? Do they come in and consult you and try to get the history before they destroy it, or they just?
Well, they do, and sometimes they listen to our our suggestions, and sometimes they don't. The Society, of course, is a private organization. It is not the only preservationist group in town, but we have similar feelings with the Historic Preservation Commission, which is a commission for the town of Huntington. The town historian, which is, of course, he's the secretary of that commission and also a town employee, but we all have the similar feelings and we all have similar suggestions and hopes. When we get over to that wall, we'll see some of the buildings that have been preserved and some of the buildings that haven't been preserved and some of the buildings that are in danger of being preserved. So I think that would be a good wall to go to next.
I think what you were touching on there, Dina, was that we really do need a historic overlay district in our town.
Definitely, we do.
Yeah, before it's all gone.
Yeah.
Or before it's unrecognizable and future generations won't even have a clue.
Yep, because the old Aboff building, the Hotel Huntington, that was one of the two projects that I had stood up against. And we dressed up in Flapper Fair when we went to the town board with boas and fun flapper dresses. And we had gotten historical designation on that building by the state. And it was reversed within 48 hours. And they have successfully now turned it into a cookie cutter TD Bank.
Such a shame. It really
Right.
is. Gotta keep it clean, though. Gotta keep it clean.
Yes. Not always to do when you just love the town and the history in it and you just have a different vision of it.
Yeah.
Over here we have the portrait of a man who is defined as the conscience of Huntington, and he was a local and not a mogul. But he went off to college, came back, he studied law, but he was one of the founders of the Bank of Huntington, and that's got him started. But then he became almost a part of every civic association that ever was formed during this period, as he lived during the entire period. He not only did he help form the Bank of Huntington, which is now, I think, Bank of America, and they built that building in 1916. He also was obviously the treasurer of a lot of organizations, including the SAR, but he was the founder of a lot of organizations. He was a member of the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Association that built this building. He was a member of the Yacht Club that was formed. He's a member of the Huntington Country Club when it was originally formed during this period. And when they opened the Huntington Theater, which is today the Paramount, they had a big celebration. That was in 1927. He lives on to 1944, but in 1927, he was getting on in years. And when they introduced him as the conscience of Huntington, and I believe he surely was. He is probably the most influential man that lived during this period that we were talking about from 1890 to 1940.
Out of all the portraits on the wall, he was the one that I felt the most kindred spirit with.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Oh, here we go. This one was hard to find. I apologize for that delay. But this is the one where he goes over the buildings that are in danger of or have already been preserved. This one's a good one.
Okay, over on this wall, we put pictures, photographs of the buildings that were built during the 5 decades that we're talking about, the 1890s through the 1930s. And over here, we see the actual foundation construction of this building, the 1892 Soldiers and Sailors building. And next to that, we have Locust Lodge. Now, Locust Lodge was built originally from an old farmhouse and then eventually built up on Huntington Bay. It was a big resort area. Became a resort on Huntington Bay, which is today Huntington Bay. It stands on the property that is today the Bay Club. And that was built during this period of time. Locust Lodge, it was called. And down below that, we have the elementary school that was built in 1898. It's part of the complex of Town Hall. It's the western end of Town Hall, because it was built next to the high school building, which is over here. It was built in 1909, in the next decade. Down below, of course, you have the yacht club that was formed in the 1890s, 1895, I believe, or 94. That building that you see there is no longer with us because it burned down and was replaced in the 1950s with the current building. But as we get into the 1900s, Locust Lodge, which I said was a resort on Huntington Bay, the Beaux-Arts Chateau Casino building was built on the bay in front of it at one point, and it was a great spot for wealthy people to come out in summer and party. This is the location of the Bay Club. It is not the Bay Club today. Well, when they replaced it and built the new building, they may have tried to do that. Of course, this building here is the 1905 Trade School, which is the headquarters and archives of the Huntington Historical Society, and that building still stands and has been recently restored. Down below it is the Masonic Temple, which stands on New York Avenue. Still a beautiful building and serves the community today. The Episcopal Church, St. John's on Main Street, that is actually the third Episcopal Church building built in Huntington after a fire in 1905 to their building that was on Park Avenue, which is where the cemetery is today, still is today. And this building was built in 1906. And as we get into the 1910s, we find the first town hall that was built as a building in 1910 that still stands today. And the future of that building is hopefully good. They have plans to add to it, and then in the back, and convert it into a boutique hotel that I think should serve the community nicely. Down below, we have the Bank of Huntington that we said was started by Douglas Conklin, and this building was built in 1916. The building below is the Palace Theater that was built on New York Avenue. Now that building still stands today, but you wouldn't recognize it. But it's value drugs. It's where value drugs is. Yeah. Yeah, the cars are great. And here we have the telephone building, which of course we mentioned earlier as being now the home of the Huntington Public Library. They moved there in 1958. And above, of course, we have a very controversial building in today's world. It's the site of a future development plan, which was the 1911 Huntington Firehouse. Now, that was the second firehouse built. The first firehouse was a smaller building on Wall Street. And unfortunately, that building, which was not really viable anymore, was torn down a couple of years ago and is being replaced by a new building on the site on the east side of Wall Street, just north of Main Street. So we've lost that firehouse. This firehouse, we would like to at least save the facade, which is so distinctive. And it's in the 1910 period, or in this period, we like to talk about it as the age of also the monumental buildings that were built in this side of town. We have Town Hall across the street. We have this building. We have the firehouse just down the street. We have the Masonic Temple that we mentioned earlier. All grand buildings that were built by the locals, in the sense that would make this town a grander place. And I think they succeeded in that. And because of their success, we have the success today. So hopefully, the developers, and we have every indication now that they will, at least save that front facade for history and the idea of what was here during this time. And of course, this next building is also very dear to the hearts of people in Huntington. Is the first hospital building that was built in 1916, opened in 1916. Now that building still stands today. It hasn't been a hospital rooms in many years because the hospital has continued to grow and grow and grow and grow. And now, but it still stands today and is being preserved, and hopefully someday we'll find a good use. And down below that, of course, is the 1912 Huntington Lighthouse, which replaced an earlier lighthouse that stood over on Lloyd Harbor. It was called the Lloyd Harbor Lighthouse. That was not really located exactly where it would do the most use. So they decided they would build this concrete structure. And luckily, we have the preservation of the Huntington Lighthouse Group that has saved that and runs tours to it. We haven't had tours now for about a year and a half because they are in the process of making sure it doesn't fall into the sea by doing restoration, raising money and doing restoration for it. In the 1920s, of course, we have the Heckscher Machine built, donated by our mogul, August Heckscher. We have a number of high schools built and designed by our August Gallo, who was in the class of 1912 at Huntington High School. There are a couple of pictures of those. We have the hotel that was built in 1929. All architects was August Gallo. And the Huntington office building. Now, you won't recognize this as a three-story building, but the first two stories still survive today on Wall Street. I mean, it's where Means is, I believe. No, I'm sorry, it's not Means. Maybe it's a little bit south of that, but it's on the west side of New York Avenue. But there was a fire in it that destroyed almost all the building. They had saved the front facade, but they were afraid of its collapse. And they finally decided they would rebuild the building, keeping the first two stories of the facade, not being able to save the third story. So at least we have part of that building still with us today. In the 1930s, the WPA, of course, we were in a Great Recession, and one of the WPA projects was to build a new post office, and it was built on Carver Street, still stands today as an insurance company. And the murals that were done, of course, the WPA project was to create jobs for unemployed people, and unemployed artists were hired to make public murals, and they had these murals are still in the interior of that building. The Robert K. Toaz School was built in the late 1930s, and as well as the Cold Spring Harbor Firehouse that was designed by August Gallo as well. And then the second building of the Huntington Hospital was built in 1933. Now, this is an interesting story and building that was built. It still stands today. It's a delicatessen on Woodbury Road, there as pretty much at the intersection of High Street and Woodbury Road, or Carly Avenue and Woodbury Road. But it was built, it was started before the Depression, not completed. And so it was kind of laying there unfinished. Across the street was an elementary school, and all the children you see out there are out there for their picture being taken in front of an unfinished building. But Marshall Field III decided that he wanted to create a business that would create jobs for local Huntington people. And so he bought that building, finished it. He created the United States leather goods factory that would make expensive valises for people. And they were manufactured here in Huntington using Huntington local people, and they created jobs for them. This woman here is probably our greatest philanthropist. If Douglas Conklin is the conscience of Huntington, then Cornelia Prime and her brother Temple may have been the pocketbook of Huntington, because they came descended from a very wealthy New York City family of bankers. They came out here in 1830s and bought a house on Park Avenue, expanded it on business of his own. She lived and ended up in Huntington to be her hometown. She was very wealthy. She contributed money to help the hospital get built, to rebuild the St. John's Episcopal Church. She gave the town the money to put the tower clock in the new town hall. And she also was a contributor in built the trade school, which stands and serves the Huntington Historical Society today here on Main Street. That was originally built as a school called the Huntington Trade School. It was a school that was run by the St. John's Episcopal Church, which he was a member of. And they were working out of the basement of that church. 1905, remember, the church burned down. So they came and they needed a home. So she built them that English tutor building across the street that now serves the Huntington Historical Society. And finally, I think we can get to this section here, which really talks about preservation. This is one of the preservation groups that I didn't mention before, which is the Old Huntington Green organization. And it was incorporated in 1939, but it was actually formed in the early 30s. And again, it was formed somewhat with the Depression in mind. One of the things that they were encouraging, they were concerned about, was all the garbage and junk on the roads of Huntington. And so they started out as a road beautification group. And a number of wealthy people, including Henry Cannon, who lived in that house that still stands on across from the village green on the way to the hospital, with a large property around it. And they formed, along with Milbank and Marshall Field, they formed an organization called Old Huntington Green. And they morphed into saving historic homes and historic properties to a great extent. This building here is actually built by an owner of that house today, or the owner of that house at one time, and he built this as a dollhouse for his daughter in 1912. So this is over 100 years old in and of itself, and it's a model of a house that was built in 1805. And luckily it's part of our collection now, and we can use it in this exhibit. But it was also owned at one point by Henry Cannon. Henry Cannon was the chairman of Chase Manhattan, which has become Chase Manhattan Bank in New York. He used this as his summer home, and he, along with Milbank from Panfield, Marshall Field from Comset, got together and formed an organization whose effort was to preserve Huntington's history and Huntington's historic buildings. And so in 1939, they commissioned Pratt University to do a survey and to come up with this map of historic buildings that centered around the village green, and hence the name, Old Huntington Green. And they identified somewhat like 32 buildings that needed to be saved. They thought they would create a Williamsburg North at one point. And they went to Marshall Field with the idea that he could finance it. Well, he asked how much it would cost to finance it, and they said, well, it would cost about $1 million. And it was at the time of the Depression. It was at the time we were going off into World War II. he said, well, I can give you $5,000 or $50,000 or whatever it was at the time, which wasn't enough to introduce this grand plan. But of the 32 buildings that they identified, 28 of them still survive today in some form. And where the organization who owns some of them didn't get to own everything, a lot of the buildings are in public hands. The Arsenal was one of them, which is owned now by the town. The Kissam House on Park Avenue is another one that's owned now by the Historical Society. And there are a bunch of others that are luckily been preserved by private people or in public hands. And so most of them have been preserved. So you don't necessarily need the government to do it for you, or you can form a group or private citizens can accomplish the same things. Yeah, with pencil and crayon, I think. But it's a great map, and it's also a great story.
Toby, I have a question.
Sure.
I know you touched on it a little bit. When it comes to historically preserving Huntington, what can the locals do exactly?
Well,
Be part of to help.
Well, one of the things they can do, as many of them on this map have done, is if they purchase a private home, is to take care of it. Now, luckily, we live in a community where a lot of people care for their homes, and so that's a natural thing, whether it's old or it's new. The other thing is just to use your voices. I mean, go to town hall. And, one of the things I know the Historic Preservation Commission is tossing about is trying to create historic districts or historic areas where it isn't that we're going to be against all development in those areas, but the development should be appropriate. It should be fit into the neighborhood. I mean, a good example of that probably is some of the development that's going on. Some of it's better than others. I mean, I know that a lot of people are upset about the tremendous number of apartment buildings and the 3-story buildings. Well, if you'll notice, ironically, one of the historically, Huntington did have a lot of 3-story buildings. And of course, towns were residents above, as cities are, residents above commercial buildings. So going back to them isn't necessarily in and of itself a bad thing, but inappropriate construction, or when they tear down perfectly serviceable buildings that could have a second use to them, that's what we wish they would reconsider, and we encourage them to do that. You know, we would like to designate more homes. If you own an historic home or a historic property, we'd like you to say, I want to designate it. And a designation, historic designation in the local situation simply means that if somebody in the future wants to come and tear it down or to do extensive renovation. Now, it's the exterior, not the interior, that would be affected there. But there would be some encouragement to do something that would be appropriate to fit into the neighborhood that it lives in, and is part of being a good neighbor and part of the community. Certainly, public voice is something that has been successful. It has to be done, I think, in a civil manner at all times, which is sometimes frustrating because when it's not, you know, it doesn't seem that they're getting the point. It's hard not to get a little bit more excited about it, but at the same point, you want to, in the end, your product is to preserve the building, at least indicating in some form so it get a second reuse.
Wow, so much, huh? Yeah. It just, the whole historic overlay district is really something that we completely need to see. And I think there was one more piece that he asked to show us before we wrap up part 1 of the Historical Society Soldiers and Sailors Museum and start our part 2, which will be the cemetery tour. But as we were getting ready to wrap, there was just one more piece he wanted to show us. You'll enjoy this one.
Well, with any town, there has to be recreation, and the recreation that we found here in Huntington was in the early 20th century was to build golf courses. And luckily, some of those still are with us today. The Huntington Country Club was formed in 1910 and laid out and is still serving the community today. There's a golf course around Oheka that Otto Kahn had built. There are a couple of golf courses that were built in the early 20th century that are no longer with us today. One of them was a golf course that was started by the Huntington Yacht Club. They not only wanted to be yachters and boaters, but they also founded a golf links at the top of Youngs Hill Road. It's today a community that was developed in 1950. And actually, when you hear and if you visit the exhibit, you can see that aerial view over there of Huntington Harbor. And at the very top is a kind of a bare spot up there. Well, that's when they're developing. They're taking down the golf course and developing a modern development up on Old Town Lane and so forth. The other golf course, of course, is the Crescent Club, which is started by a club in Brooklyn. They came out here, and at one point they actually built 32 golf courses, 36 holes. Today, they've narrowed that down to only one. And so there's information about those golf courses here in the exhibit as well.
Well, I hope everybody learned a lot. I know that we did.
Absolutely. And anybody watching, if you want to learn more, you definitely have to go visit. You definitely have to just walk in the door and go visit and see everything for yourself.
It's a free event.
Yeah, and there's so much to see.
Well, I just want to thank them for the Huntington Historical Society, as well as Mr. Kissam for our private tour and our privilege of being able to bring this to other people in the form that we are doing today. And I hope everyone tunes in for part 2, the cemetery tour. Ladies, any final words?
No, I don't.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.